Bird migration is a marvel of nature. And the springtime migration is near its peak in the northern hemisphere right now. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. Welcome to International Migratory Bird Day and the final day of Bird Week on Explore.org. This has been a celebration of birds and an opportunity to learn more about their amazing lives and abilities. It's been wonderful to watch, live footage on Explore.org of all of these different birds, like the Decorah eagles on the bottom frame there, and of course, a live look in at some white pelicans on the Mississippi River. Over the next hour, we'll explore the phenomenon specifically of bird migration through interviews with biologists and conservationists who study and work to protect birds in the habitats they need to survive. First, we'll head to Central California to discuss migratory flyways and the importance of wildlife refuges for birds in the United States. Then we'll travel inland to Nebraska, where hundreds of thousands of sandhill cranes gather every spring on their journey north. Bird migration also transcends entire continents and highlights the challenges of protecting birds and wild animals when they travel across international boundaries. To learn more about that, we'll go to Africa to discuss the nomadic nature of flamingos. And then to learn about a travel corridor used by many millions of birds as they migrate between Africa, Europe, Asia, and parts of the Arctic. We're also doing a giveaway during the broadcast today, so we'll be giving a away a prize to a lucky winner from all of the places where we are streaming live right now, and I'll announce those winners at the end of the broadcast. So please stay tuned for that. First, allow me to introduce you to a few of the greatest endurance athletes on Earth. Some birds migrate thousands of miles in a single effort without stopping to rest, eat, or drink. So if running a marathon seems like an intimidating task, consider this. Imagine for a moment that you are a bar-tailed godwit, a chunky shorebird that nests on the tundra of western Alaska. The long days of summer were good to you. The tundra and wetlands provided ample invertebrates to feed you and your clutch of chicks. It's late summer now, though, and as the days get shorter, you sense that food will soon be in short supply. To survive, you must leave your summer home and complete a dangerous journey. One day in September, you take flight and disappear south over the Pacific Ocean. Amazingly, you won't stop until you reach New Zealand. Hi everyone, Mike Fitz here with Explore.org. Let's explore long-distance migration in birds, a superpower of athletic endurance. Migration is a regular, seasonal movement away from and back to a specific region or habitat. Every spring in the northern hemisphere, billions of birds migrate north from their wintering areas to reach breeding grounds in Europe, Asia, and North America. The journey reverses after the breeding season, although some birds follow different fall migration routes compared to spring. Even if a bird finds rest stops along the way, migration is a risky endeavor. It requires great amounts of energy and exposes birds to the hazards posed by predators, weather, and terrain. The risk grows even greater when birds migrate over areas where they cannot survive. For birds adapted to live on land, for example, stopping in the ocean means almost certain death. In September and October, some migrating blackpoll warblers depart on a non-stop transoceanic flight from coastal Maine and eastern Canada to the north coast of South America. They fly for 72 hours straight and cover more than 2,500 miles. While impressive, the blackpoll's feat is eclipsed by bar-tailed godwits, some of whom fly direct from Alaska to New Zealand, a 7,000-mile trans-Pacific journey. To reach their destination, the godwits fly non-stop for 8 days. Godwits and warblers are active flyers, meaning they must flap their wings continuously to stay airborne, unlike birds better adapted to glide, such as vultures and albatross. Flapping flight is unrivaled in its efficiency in covering distance in a short amount of time. However, flight of this style also demands a lot of energy. In the days leading up to their departure, blackpoll warblers and godwits double their body mass with accumulated fat. And once in flight, they temporarily dispense with organs that are not needed. Their liver and intestines shrink to save weight. With no opportunity to refuel in flight, they will have exhausted their fat reserves by the time they reach their destination. Unfortunately, the challenges of migration have grown even greater in recent decades. Windows and artificial lights disorient birds. In some areas, illegal hunting kills migrating birds when they are most vulnerable. Pollution and climate change alter habitats that birds evolved to utilize. Development can destroy places that migrating birds need to complete their journeys. Stopover sites might be used for only a few days per year, but without them, birds might not be able to complete their migrations. Imagine the difficulty you'd experience while running for a few hours straight without food or water. Your muscles would cramp, your body would be in pain, and you'd soon lose the ability to continue as you depleted your energy and became dehydrated. In contrast, migrating birds like godwits are superpowered to survive much more difficult situations. They achieve feats of endurance that far surpass that of even the most fit human athletes. We have a couple other bird superpower videos on our YouTube channel, so please check those out if you want to see more. There's one on woodpeckers and how they avoid brain damage, and another about feathers. The endurance of birds is incredible, and although the rewards of this effort are great, the trip is also incredibly dangerous. Migration challenges a bird's instincts, fitness, and skills. Flyways and the stopover sites along the way help to ensure that birds can survive the hazards they may face. A flyway is an established route used year after year by large numbers of migrating birds, with many birds converging to use similar flyways. The Pacific Flyway is particularly important for birds in Western North America. Beginning in February, Sandhill cranes depart their winter homes and start a long journey north. For some cranes, the trip will carry them as far as western Alaska and eastern Siberia. Most of those in the mid-continent of North America, however, no matter their final destination, will stop to rest and feed along the Platte River in south central Nebraska. Platte River has an oversized importance for migrating sandhill cranes, and to explore why, I'm joined by Cody Wagner, a conservation program manager at the Roe Audubon Sanctuary in Gibbon, Nebraska. Cody, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Mike.
And the Sandhill crane cam that we have on Explore.org is one of my favorite cams. When the cranes are there, it is such an incredible sight, and I've never been there in person, so I'm really interested to hear from your perspective as someone who's on the ground, able to observe the birds. My first question for you, though, is how many Sandhill cranes use Platte River during the spring migration? It really seems it's hard for me to estimate when I look at the camera and just see what looks like thousands and thousands of birds within the camera's line of sight.
Sure. Well, thousands and thousands is exactly correct. Right now, we're estimating a little over 1 million cranes in the mid-continent migratory population. And really, the majority of this kind of population of cranes is going to be using a 75-mile critical reach of the Platte River during their spring migration. And as far as Roe Sanctuary's kind of 5 miles worth of river goes, we've had up to 220,000 sandhill cranes counted on our 5 miles.
Wow, that is incredible numbers of birds. And what makes the Platte River such an attractive habitat for sandhill cranes?
Sure. So sandhill cranes have likely stopped at the Platte River for thousands of years, at the very least since the Platte River itself, as it kind of exists in its modern form, was created back at the end of the last ice age, 10 to 12,000 years ago. The wide, shallow river channel really provides great roosting habitat for cranes, and the water is thought to act as an alarm against any predators that might be approaching while they're actually roosting. Also, the river historically had wide bands of wet meadows and grasslands that provided an abundance of food for cranes to gain the energy they needed to complete this spring migration. Um, that is not necessarily the kind of state of things anymore. A lot of those grassland spaces have been replaced by cornfields and agriculture, but the cranes are extremely adaptable. They have taken full advantage of this new food source, eating the waste grain left over in the fields, and they really thrived still, being able to make that change. They still rely, though, on these remaining grassland spaces because they need that nutrition that is present from that natural food source in order to have the most successful nesting that they can.
So it's a really important stopover site for them. It's not their final destination, though. So where are these birds going on their journey north?
Yeah, so a lot of the cranes are going to be heading up into the Dakotas, Canada. Some will go as far as Alaska or even eastern Siberia. And they're mostly starting out their journey in Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. So the way that we always describe it is these birds are spreading out in a fan that then pinches kind of in an hourglass shape right here at the Platte River before they spread right back out north again.
And when they're at the river in large numbers, I mean, the river is a noisy place. It almost overwhelms the microphone on the webcam sometimes, especially when there's a lot of cranes taking off. Why do the cranes call so often when they're on the ground or when they're in flight?
Sure. Well, until we perfect that crane call translator, we won't really know exactly what those cranes are saying, but we can make some kind of inferences based on their behavior. So one of the really kind of unique behaviors that you'll be able to easily see on the camera or hear when you're actually at Rose Sanctuary is that mated pairs of cranes will call in unison, a way of kind of establishing just this little bit of territory for a bird that's really used to not having to share such a space with so many others. They're used to having kind of pretty large territories. Of course, calls may also be done to communicate with other members of their family group or communicate with other nearby cranes. But like I said, we just need to work a little bit more on that crane call translator if we really truly want to know what they're talking about.
Maybe one day we'll have that ability. You mentioned before that there are thousands and thousands of cranes that utilize, this stretch of the Platte River. So what would the loss of the Platte River and sort of like the dynamic with the shallow water and the sandy areas where cranes can find sanctuary, what would the loss of that mean for the survival of, the populations of sandhills in North America?
Sure. So the Platte River ecosystem and this particular section of the Platte River is really the most important stopover place for sandhill cranes northward migration. And it's really critical to providing those energy resources and the protection that they need. It's sort of difficult to actually go through and make any predictions about what would happen to population numbers if the Platte River just was no longer usable to cranes. But we can say one thing for sure, and that's if we don't have people who care and people who want to protect the Platte River and restore it to what it once was, then we will lose the spectacle of this migration, and it would potentially end one of the last great mass migrations on Earth.
And when you're there along the river, my final question for you is sort of about that experience. At the sanctuary, you have blinds where people can reserve and go into and spend some time observing cranes without disturbing them. So what's it like during that experience? What's it like to be in a blind at the Platte River at sunrise when the area is just filled with thousands of bugling cranes?
Sure. So sometimes it really can be so quiet when you're walking out to our viewing structures that you aren't even really sure if the cranes are still on the river. As you are in the blind and things just start getting a little bit lighter out, you can see what first looked like islands in the river are in fact the roosting cranes. Oftentimes, the crane song of the morning just starts out with a few voices here or there, and then it's slowly going to rise to a crescendo. And basically, it just sounds like the whole orchestra is tuning up at once. And if you're really lucky, sometimes that whole river full of cranes will take off together, and the air is just filled with the sounds of their bugles. And it is really one of the most awe-inspiring things that you can see. And it's almost impossible to be anywhere else in that moment except with those cranes, which I think is what really attracts people to this experience. It's almost sort of spiritual in nature.
It sounds incredible, and maybe one day I'll have the opportunity to get out there and visit it in person. Of course, we have the webcams, which is another remarkable way to visit the cranes every day when they're there in season. And Cody, I want to thank you so much for joining me and sharing your expertise on sandhill cranes and working to protect them in their habitat.
Yeah, well, thank you guys so much for having me. And thank you out there to all of those camera watchers. I mean, your support really does matter as well to helping make sure that we can protect this river and this migration.
That was Cody Wagner with the Roe Audubon Sanctuary in Nebraska. Find more info about the sanctuary and their work at rowe.audubon.org. That's ROWE.audubon.org. And put it on your calendar to watch the cranes on Exploded.org next March and April. When there are thousands of cranes on camera, it is truly an amazing sight. Now, you might be wondering, but Mike, your lead in to that interview didn't have anything to do with cranes, and that's correct. We meant to show the flyway interview initially, but here it is, the flyway interview with Brendan Lee at Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge. Across the Northern Hemisphere right now, billions of birds are in the process of an epic journey as they migrate from their wintering areas to their breeding grounds. Although the rewards of this effort are great, the trip is also dangerous. Migration challenges birds' instincts, athleticism, fitness, and skills. Flyways and the stopover sites they experience along the way help to ensure that migrating birds can survive the hazards they may experience. To help us understand the phenomenon of a flyway, particularly the Pacific Flyway on the west coast of North America, and the ways in which national wildlife refuges help to protect bird habitat, I'm joined by Brendan Lee, an assistant refuge manager with the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge in California. Brendan, thanks so much for taking the time out of the day to join me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure.
Well, let's jump into it. I love visiting national wildlife refuges. I love watching birds there. And your refuge in particular attracts tremendous amounts of birds in season, and it's important habitat for birds year round. So I'm wondering, my first question for you is, how does the refuge really fit into the larger Pacific Flyway that birds use in Western North America?
Yeah, so the Sacramento Valley is a core wintering area for waterfowl within the Pacific Flyway. The valley supports millions of ducks and geese over the winter, and they really are reliant on these refuges, state wildlife areas, as well as flooded rice and other ag when those resources are available. In addition to that, it's also hundreds of thousands of shorebirds and other wildlife that are relying on the 70,000 some acres of managed wetlands, as well as over 300,000 acres of flooded rice, again, when it's available.
And the wetlands at the refuge are used by birds as a stopover site during migration, as well as an overwintering site where birds might stay for weeks or months before they leave again for their breeding grounds. Each species of bird and really each individual bird is different. So perhaps it can be a little bit hard to generalize, but when we look at water birds like ducks and geese and compare those to wading birds like a sandpiper, what might determine whether they make the refuge a temporary stop or a place to spend the entire winter?
Yeah, so just like all creatures, birds are driven by survival. And that is the available resources on the landscape, as well as reducing or minimizing the risk of getting killed, so predation usually. So overwintering is really driven by the calories that are made available on the landscape, and individual birds will move throughout the Central Valley or wherever they're located just to meet that caloric need. So that's really what drives it.
I also read that approximately 95% of the historic wetlands and grasslands in Central California, they've been modified or destroyed by people. And that's really just happened within the last 150 years. So this makes the remaining wetlands and similar habitats extremely important for birds. We think, and I tend to think of wildlife refuges as places of wildness and wild spaces. Those areas can also be heavily modified landscapes. With so much of the surrounding habitat lost already, how do you work to protect and diversify a landscape like the Sacramento refuge so that different types of birds benefit throughout the year?
Yeah, so it's definitely true. The land that we manage is highly modified from its natural state. Um, and we kind of manage to try to replicate the natural processes that would have happened, but with an understanding that it's heavily managed and highly modified. So on SAC Refuge and within our complex, our primary aim is providing foraging and refuge habitats for migratory birds. We try to manage for habitat diversity. So throughout the year, we'll have units flooded up with water, and then we may time those units being drawn down for the peak shorebird migration and provide them that newly exposed mudflat habitat. Similarly, in the summer, we'll irrigate watergrass units, and watergrass is a really good food source for waterfowl eventually in the fall and winter. But while we're irrigating this watergrass units, we'll actually provide great habitat for egrets and ibis and other wading birds. So that's not even to mention all of the other wildlife that relies on these flooded wetlands.
And I think when we've looked at the webcams, especially in the wintertime, when we see the large flocks of ducks and geese, I mean, it's a spectacular sight. And I especially enjoy, watching, your groups of shovelers that that use the water and dabble in the water with their big oversized bills. I'm wondering where do many of those birds travel when they migrate north in spring? Do you have any specific info about maybe from tracking or banding studies that give us an idea about where those birds go to breed during the summertime?
Yeah, so obviously in the spring, the birds are heading back up to their breeding grounds. And we actually here on the refuge support some awesome banding programs, not only by our staff, but also by other organizations who utilize our ground for their banding efforts. And just as an example, well, our biologist gets band returns from all over North America, and it's always cool. He reports to us when he gets them, especially ones like this year. He got one as far away as Mississippi, which was a little green-winged teal, which is really cool. And as far as the webcam, it was an idea that was brought to us by our friends group. And working here, the staff at Sacramento Refuge and all the refuges nationwide and wild areas, we get to see things kind of behind the scene that are areas closed to the public that are just on a daily basis mind-blowing. And so we really felt as a staff that the webcam would provide an opportunity for the public to see these behind the scenes things that we get to see on a daily basis and have that available to them on demand.
I completely agree. It's a wonderful view into the lives of the birds and the phenomenon of large gatherings of birds at the refuge. My final question for you, though, is about flyways and migration corridors. I'm wondering, when you consider flyways, you consider migration corridors, and you consider national wildlife refuges, how do all of those things sort of fit together as part of an effort to better protect habitat for birds and bird populations?
Yeah, so we kind of take it for granted, I guess, these days. We're lucky or not lucky. We've put work into supporting relatively healthy populations of ducks and geese. But that wasn't always the case. So the refuge system was actually established because of the need to protect these migratory bird species who had been significantly impacted by habitat loss and also commercial hunting, whether it was for food or feathers, especially for feathers. So for us contemporarily, it's really important that we don't lose sight of that. So that's kind of the mission that we come to work with every day. And we just need to stay vigilant in protecting this wildlife, especially migratory birds, just because that's my focus. And just really not let history repeat itself and put us in that situation again.
Absolutely. And that's a great final thought, I think, to leave our conversation on. Brendan, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Absolutely. It's been great partnering with you guys.
Thanks again to Brendan Lee for taking the time to share his insights. If you want to learn more about the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge, please visit their website at fws.gov/refuge/Sacramento, and check out our webcam at the refuge through our partnership with the Friends of Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge every day on explore.org. The Sacramento Refuge provides an example of a place that can be attractive to a broad range of bird species, but not all places are of equal importance to birds. Bird migration is an international affair. It links states, provinces, nations, continents, and hemispheres. So during the last half of our broadcast, let's move to Africa. While flamingos aren't a classic migratory species per se, they routinely move long distances, and that complicates efforts to protect them and their habitats. Flamingos are iconic. They are widely recognized even by people who might not devote much attention to birds. Their specialized adaptations and lifestyle also make them especially vulnerable to habitat loss. To help us learn more about lesser flamingos in Southern Africa and some of the work being done to protect them, I'm joined by Mark Anderson, a Chief Executive Officer with BirdLife South Africa, a nonprofit whose mission is to conserve their habitats and biodiversity through science, sustainable and equitable use of natural resources, and by encouraging people to value nature. Mark, thanks for taking the time out of your day to join me.
Absolute pleasure, Mike. Nice to chat with you.
And flamingos are such unique birds. And I guess maybe we can start there. We can start by talking about where and how they live. Lesser flamingos, who the species that you're very familiar with, have specialized bills and tongues that are adapted to filter planktonic algae and small invertebrates out of water. They can fly long distances as well, so they have access to wetlands and lakes across much of Africa. With those abilities, however, flamingos congregate, from what I've read, in specific areas. So why might that be?
They prefer very ephemeral pans and lakes. So there's not many of those throughout Africa. In Southern Africa, there's literally only two large ones, one in Namibia, Tosha pan, and one in Botswana, Sewer pan. And then there's this ephemeral pan, which has now become a dam in South Africa, where they also occur. But they're very large lakes and pans, which are seasonally inundated and with only a few inches of water. That's the kind of habitat they prefer. And also these wetlands are also quite saline. So they're quite specific in their requirements. I mean, we've got a lot more water available in many other wetlands throughout the continent. They are quite specific in their requirements.
And even though lesser flamingos utilize the coastline of Africa, they don't breed along that. And you mentioned how they like saline areas. From what I've read as well, they nest and raise chicks in precious few locations. So why is their breeding habitat so limited and specific?
So it's a really interesting species. It's the world's most numerous flamingo. They number in the millions, 2 to 4 million perhaps. We don't know exactly how many. But they, until recently, only bred at 3 places in Africa. As I mentioned, the Tosha pan in Namibia, Sewer pan in Botswana, and then Lake Natron in northern Tanzania. And they like these very large ephemeral wetlands, and where they can congregate en masse. So you'll never get flamingos breeding at a small pan or lake, in contrast to their cousin, the greater flamingo, which also occurs in Africa. They prefer very, very large wetlands where they will aggregate in their tens of thousands. And there's probably many reasons why. One of them is they built these nest turrets. They need fairly shallow water in which to build the nest. If the water was too deep, they wouldn't be able to build them. And also, they're quite vulnerable to depredation by predators, things such as hyenas, jackals, even some raptors. So I think they, if they breed on these very vast pans and lakes, they're able to, breed, have their breeding on the shoreline, and then be a distance away from predators.
And Explode.org partners with Africam and your organization, BirdLife South Africa, to provide webcam footage of flamingos at Camphor's Dam in South Africa. This is a relatively new breeding colony of lesser flamingos, and one that you've been involved in establishing. So what makes that water body attractive to them? I imagine it's probably some of the same things that you've mentioned, but maybe some other differences as well.
Yeah, so I've been monitoring the lesser flamingo population at Camphor's Dam for quite a few decades, and it always surprised the fact that they occurred there year round, and that they built a few nest turrets and even, in fact, laid a few eggs. They never bred successfully. It probably had to do with the fact that this wetland, which is only 400 hectares in size, is relatively small compared to the other lakes and species breeds. But nevertheless, because the problems the species faces, because it has so few breeding sites, literally too few eggs in its basket, we decided to copy the work that had been done in the Camargue and the Rhone Delta with greater flamingos. Alan Johnson built an island for greater Camargue, and the greater flamingos accepted that island relatively quickly and bred successfully, and they have most years subsequently for quite a few number of decades. So we thought, with the large number of lesser flamingos at Camphor's Dam, maybe we should try and attract them, make the wetland more attractive site. And because it's relatively small and there are predators in the area, particularly black-backed jackals and feral dogs, we had to build an island, a very large island, away 200 meters distance from the shoreline. And we had a donor, a Carper Mining, that were happy to fund this project because it was an undertaking. So we built this island, and we're apprehensive initially about whether they would breed or not, because they, because of the size of the wetland, only 400 hectares in size, much smaller than any of the other wetlands. But the advantage we had is there are large numbers of birds. Understand, we've record regularly between 80 and 100,000, perhaps even more. And I mentioned the fact that they need large wetlands. It's not a large wetland, but they do need to occur in large numbers, I think, for them to breed. The other important factor is that there is a rich supply of these called cyanobacteria, and the green-blue algae is the other name. And because of nutrient enrichment, because of the partially treated sewage water that flows into this dam, the blue-green algae have actually proliferated. In fact, the work that we've done with Dr. Jan Roos, who's an expert on blue, found that it's probably one of the water bodies with the highest concentration of blue-green algae in the world. So we built this island, and the flamingos accepted it relatively quickly. They didn't breed in the first year, but they bred in the subsequent year. They bred the year thereafter. And then, unfortunately, the island flooded because of rising water levels, and they stopped breeding on the island, but they did then start breeding on the shoreline. And the significance of this project is we established the fourth breeding locality for the species in Africa. And they only occasionally breed at a couple of places in India. So, essentially the sixth breeding locality for the species in the world. A species that numbers, as I said, in the millions. So it was a significant conservation achievement, and one of for which we're actually very proud.
And you should be. It looks like a monumental project, and we get to enjoy that on our Flamingo Cam on Explore.org every day. And the flamingos, of course, they move around quite a bit. There seems to be debate, from what I've read, among scientists about how to define the movements of lesser flamingos. Some studies describe them as partial migrants, while others are firm in their conviction that lesser flamingos are nomadic, and they just kind of go where the habitat is best for them at that moment. So how does the variable movement of these birds make or complicate their efforts to protect them?
It's a very good question, Mike. And, I describe them as being nomadic because they don't regularly move between us. So currently at Camphor's Dam, we had very few flamingos. And the reason being is we've had the best summer rainfall in southern Africa in decades, perhaps 30 years, 35 years. The rainfall has been significant, and many of these ephemeral wetlands have now been inundated with water and dispersed across the region. And how they locate these ephemeral wetlands once they become inundated is a real mystery, because the wetland can become inundated, and literally 2 or 3 days later there could be several thousand lesser flamingos and greater flamingos that frequent it and will then feed in the wetland. So making use of so many wetlands, pans and lakes across southern Africa, it's not just individual places that one needs to protect. Now, some of them are well protected, but the majority are not protected. And this does create some conservation challenges for us. The mortality factors is collisions with overhead cables of electricity lines. And there are sometimes wetlands which are adjacent to an electricity line, a power line, and maybe this wetland may be inundated for the first time in several decades. The birds make use of it, and unfortunately they fly into the cables and have large numbers of birds dying in this way. So it is a challenge to conserve a species that is nomadic, and I think we really need to perhaps concentrate our efforts, as we do, at the places where they occur more regularly. And of course, there are only 3 places in southern Africa where they most frequently. The other aspect of the bird is we don't understand the movements very well. Dr. Graham McCulloch, who studied them in Botswana, fitted satellite tracking devices to a number of lesser flamingos, and they did move around. They moved between Botswana and Namibia, and between Botswana and South Africa. So they moved around quite extensively. One bird that was tracked actually flew across the Mozambique Channel to Madagascar, interestingly enough. But so they do move around quite extensively. But what I can tell you, which is really, really interesting, is that despite the satellite tracking that we've done in southern Africa, and the satellite tracking that's been done at Dr. Brooks Childress, the late Dr. Brooks Childress, there's no evidence at all of movement between East Africa and southern Africa. We have about 100,000 to perhaps 200,000 lesser flamingos in southern Africa. There are several million on the Great Rift Valley Lakes in East Africa, but there is no evidence yet to support the movements of the lesser flamingo between these 2 regions.
So their lifestyles, their uniqueness in so many ways makes it a challenge to conserve them. And my final question for you, goes back to sort of like that success of establishing a breeding colony at Campers Dam. What do you think are some of the lessons that we can take away from that success?
That is also an interesting question, Mike. I'm a conservationist, and I have been for the better part of 30 years. And I'm also establishing a colony, a breeding island, to encourage flamingos to breed at a site that they never bred at historically, in a country they'd never bred at historically, because lesser flamingos had never previously been recorded to breed in South Africa, was for me something that I was a little bit concerned about, something that was perhaps a project that we shouldn't embark on. But the world is not in a great place, and I think that more and more kind of management interventions like this are necessary. BirdLife South Africa has a project where we're trying to establish a new mainland colony for the African penguin, which is endangered. The numbers of these birds precipitously. So I think around the world in future, we're going to find that there's many more of these kind of interventions which can assist a species. And this being one prime example. And, we were absolutely overjoyed when lesser flamingos bred at Campers Dam, and they bred a number of years at Campers Dam. The other sites, particularly at Toshapan, they breed at infrequently, not every year. I think at Toshapan every 7 years, perhaps even less frequently. And the inundations of these pans is now less regular with climate change and drying arid parts of the region. So these kind of going to be necessary for the conservation of species such as the lesser flamingo, although only near threatened, with the threats and particularly to the few pans and lakes where they breed, could potentially be uplisted to a higher red data book category in future.
Well, they're special birds, and thank you for your work to help conserve them. And thanks for taking some time out of your day to help us learn more about flamingos. So thanks for joining me, Mark.
It's an absolute pleasure, Mike. Thanks very much. And for those who've never traveled to Africa to see flamingo, I can tell you it's a wonderful spectacle. Do so in your lifetime.
Thanks to Mark Anderson from BirdLife South Africa for that information. Flamingos are a particularly fascinating bird with a unique yet vulnerable lifestyle. And if you want to learn more about them, please visit birdlife.org.za and watch the flamingo cam at Campers Dam every day on explore.org. Although flamingos aren't a true migratory species, Africa is an especially important area for migrating birds. And Mark brought up an important point at the very end of our conversation, and that is that people will likely have to become increasingly involved in the preservation of wildlife, especially as climate change alters habitats across the world and human society increases our overall footprint. The last segment in our bird migration event is about an effort in Africa to help birds make their migratory journeys. Each year, billions of birds migrate from their northern breeding grounds in Europe, Asia, and parts of the Arctic to their wintering areas in western and southern Africa. The journey then reverses as birds return north. The East Atlantic Flyway is an important corridor on this migration. Its stepping stones of habitat provide stopover sites for birds to rest and feed, but birds using this flyway must cross many different nations, each with its own diversity of cultures and relationships with wildlife. To discuss this flyway and some of the work being done to protect the birds and the habitats along its length, I'm joined by Bronwyn Marie, the project manager for BirdLife South Africa's East Atlantic Flyway Initiative. Bronwyn, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to join me.
Hi, Mike. It's really great to be here and looking forward to chatting a little bit more detail about this flyway.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. I'm, of course, more familiar with flyways in North America, so this, I think, will be quite illuminating for me. In an earlier part of our program, we were introduced to the concept of a migratory flyway, and your work focuses on the East Atlantic Flyway. Can you talk about the geographic area of that flyway and what area of the world it encompasses?
Sure, Mike. So the East Atlantic Flyway is one of the 8 major flyways used by approximately 1,800 of the world's 11,000 bird species which migrate. They migrate in a circular route from their northern breeding grounds in Eurasia, so from locations such as the United States or Canada, Iceland, Serbia, or Northern Europe, to their wintering areas in Western and Southern Africa. And some of the key sites along the flyway include the Wadden Sea, which stretches from the Netherlands through to Germany and Denmark, the Bajagos Archipelago in Guinea-Bissau, and then more locally, the Langebaan Lagoon in South Africa. So many of these birds that you've mentioned travel thousands of kilometers along this flyway, and they really rely on a series of high-quality coastal and inland sites as stopover points to feed and rest and refuel. So the East Atlantic Flyway is this network of stopover sites used each year by these migrating birds. But many of these coastal stopover sites and inland stopover sites are also really important for humans, and they provide many resources, livelihoods, and economic development. But obviously, due to a number of threats, many of the bird populations in this flyway are in decline.
And you mentioned that it's of course a lot of different types of birds that use the flyway. So how are different types of birds using the flyway? So maybe to be more specific, how does like a wading bird, such as a Eurasian curlew, use the flyway compared to something like a turtle dove or a bird that you've been working with, the European roller?
That's a really interesting question, Mike. So as I've mentioned, this flyway is really important for coastal and wader species, as well as land birds, with approximately 90 million birds utilizing this flyway every year. So waders particularly are dependent on key sites, many of which are well known and that have long-term data or monitoring data sets. So we really are aware where these sites are located, and that makes the conservation of wader species much easier to achieve. But it also means that one broken link in this chain will have a huge impact on these populations that utilize the flyways. Land birds on the other side, such as turtle doves or European rollers, they migrate on what we call broad fronts, which really just means they utilize multiple stopover sites and very different wintering sites to each other. So there's actually been a study done by Fitch et al., which showed that the average distance between two individuals of the same population during a non-breeding season was 743 kilometers. And actually, on average, 62% of species have an average distance of more than 500 kilometers between individuals from the same breeding area. So now you can imagine how this makes the conservation of land birds much more difficult to manage when compared to waders, as they follow these numerous routes that face several different threats on their journeys across these rapidly changing landscapes.
Those of us who live in temperate or subarctic parts of the northern hemisphere, I still got snow on the ground behind me, so it's still very much sort of like in that in-between season between winter and what we would call spring in my area. We tend to think that birds traveling south or birds are going to their wintering areas, but once they arrive in western and southern Africa, the birds don't experience anything like a typical temperate or arctic winter. So migration is dangerous. But what advantages does traveling to this area provide birds who breed in Europe and beyond, like in the Arctic?
So firstly, I'll just start by saying that species utilize a number of different strategies to migrate, and these range from complete migrations, where you have all the individuals of a particular species migrating, and this includes species like your Arctic tern, to migrations that are done by some individuals of a group who choose to go. So that's often based on the availability of resources. And then you also get what we call differential migration, which occurs when you have species or different groups within a species have different strategies. So for example, that might be younger animals migrating shorter distances compared to older animals, or where you have males and females that migrate different times of the year or across different distances. So pretty much the main reasons species will migrate southwards include moving to sites that offer increased resources or the necessary resources. So whether this is for breeding, feeding, resting, or raising their young. So as I've mentioned, they will go from a lower resource area to a higher resource area. They also move to avoid seasonal environmental changes, such as the cold temperatures that you're experiencing, to find food in areas that are warmer. And in this case, it also could be that they're avoiding drought areas or flooding areas. But obviously, in our case, they're coming to a really nice, sunny, warm environment that offers the necessary resources.
And earlier you mentioned too that these birds are moving across areas with different people, different cultures. So how does working with people across international boundaries complicate the challenges of protecting habitats along the flyway?
Yeah, Mike, as you say, this is a really complicated challenge that we have. And as with anything, working in a siloed approach can really only achieve so much. So these migrant birds obviously do not know country borders, yet they're crossing numerous country borders in every direction that they travel. So this makes it imperative that we really work together to ensure the habitats are conserved for these species to continue to migrate. So some of the challenges we and the birds are facing include increased urbanization, agricultural expansion, which make it really difficult for these birds to migrate across these changing landscapes, as well as illegal hunting and killing of these birds on their route and collisions with infrastructure such as power lines and wind turbines. So with the people aspect, we really need to ensure that we strengthen the capacity of people and organizations along the flyway to understand and mitigate the threats to these species, to improve the management and the protection of these key sites that these species are utilizing, and influencing policy on a national, regional, and global level to ensure that there's better protection for species. And ultimately, we really need to demonstrate the value of a really coordinated approach along this flyway.
And if someone like me or someone in Europe or in Africa, someone who's just concerned with the welfare of birds and wants to conserve their populations, how can we help to conserve the migratory birds?
Thanks, Mike. Again, a really great question, because you may wonder, as you said, what can you do? So there are a number of migrant species which we know are in decline, and some of which you may have noticed in your own areas around where you live, as well as a number of unknowns when it comes to migrant bird species. So one of the ways that individuals can help is to record migrant birds when they see them in their areas. So whether that's arriving or through the migrant period that they are there. This helps us to understand any changes in arrival and departure times, and any changes in population statuses and trends. So currently there are a number of birding platforms that can be used depending on where you're located. These include birding apps such as BirdLasso or eBird, where you can record the species that you see, as well as bird atlasing projects such as the Second Southern African Bird Atlas Project, or SABAP2. There may also be other opportunities around where you stay that you can get involved in monitoring projects, such as the European Roller Monitoring Project that I've just launched here in South Africa, where citizen scientists can record roller sightings in set transects in set reserves. And all this data really helps to highlight any potential concerns when we see declines in species, as well as helps us to sort of investigate and tackle any potential conservation issues linked to these species.
And I do have one final question for you. And I think this one might be sort of a fun one to get an answer about. What do you think about when you see a bird that has just completed or is about to embark on a long distance journey? What sort of thoughts and emotions might that sighting prompt?
Yeah, I mean, it's really always exciting for me when I see the first migrants of the season coming into South Africa, sort of November time in our area. And it fascinates me that they've all taken these completely different routes to get here, and also the major endurance that it takes to repeatedly do this. I myself am an endurance athlete, having just completed a half Ironman this last weekend. And I know that if you haven't prepared enough, or if the course is not well laid out, that it's almost impossible to achieve such a feat. So it's really the same for these migrant species, and we need to do all that we can to protect this chain of sites along each of the flyways to ensure that they migrate along these highways in the skies for future generations.
Absolutely. It seems like migrating birds are some of nature's greatest athletes, and I think we can help them along by protecting those habitats on their flyways. And Bronwyn, I'd like to thank you for joining me today. It's been a great conversation, and I learned a lot.
Really, really great to have been here, and I'm glad that I could share some of what I do.
That was Bronwyn Marie, Project Manager for BirdLife, South Africa's East Atlantic Flyway Initiative. If you want to learn more, please check out the initiative's story map at bleafi.org. That's bleafi.org. And of course, look for some of the Flyway's marvelous birds on our webcams in Africa on explore.org. At the beginning of the broadcast, I did announce that we're going to be giving away some prizes for watching and commenting. And maybe some of you who tuned in late didn't hear that, but that doesn't mean you weren't eligible. So before we conclude, I want to announce our winners. And thanks to everybody who's been watching today on TikTok. Our winner is Baby TOKWH. On Facebook, it's Martha J. Hoover. Sanunggatuk, I hope I pronounced that correctly. I apologize if I didn't. And on explore.org, it's April Owl. And then on Reddit, it's Excitement Ordinary 9. You can claim your prizes by sending an email to feedback@explore.org. And thanks to everybody who has watched and commented and enjoyed the broadcast today. Finally, I think it's important to consider that everything in totality that we've heard about during the broadcast, birds inhabit, the densest cities as well as the wildest places on the planet. And they have really some amazing stories to tell. Migration is a fantastic example. Birds take great risks to migrate, and along the way, they might rely on pockets of habitat to ensure their survival. Others will undertake epic single-effort flights across entire oceans to reach their destinations. No matter where you live, your decisions and actions affect birds. Climate change and habitat loss fuels the challenges they face, but we can also make our communities better homes for birds. During migration seasons, that might be as simple as turning off your outside lights and covering your windows at night so that birds aren't disoriented by the artificial light. It may be helping to restore and maintain plants and trees that provide birds with places of shelter and sources of food, things like insects, seeds, and nectar. It could be helping to ensure our oceans, rivers, streams, and lakes stay clean and plastic stays out of them. And finally, it's important that we elect people at all levels of government that value wild animals and will work to protect them, including tackling the climate crisis. What is good for birds is also good for people. Be sure to get out and look for those amazing migrating birds. Animals with true superpowers, animals worthy of our attention and study, and animals that enrich our lives and world. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks to all my guests. My name is Mike Fitz. Watch all of our bird cams anytime on explore.org. And remember, never stop learning.